In this video, I'm doing a deep dive into Chianti Classico. Why Chianti Classico? Well, there's several reasons. First, this week I did a poll on my YouTube channel, and viewers expressed a strong preference for Sangiovese. Plus, I already did a video on Brunello earlier this year. In addition, quality levels in Chianti Classico have never been higher, and for reasons I'll discuss later in this video, I expect that to continue in the foreseeable future. It's also very timely, as the Consorzio for Chianti Classico just released some new regulations applicable to Gran Selezione. In this video, I'm going to briefly start out by discussing the history of Chianti Classico. After that, I'll discuss Sangiovese and some of the special growing conditions that make Chianti Classico ideally situated for the production of high-quality wine from Sangiovese. I'll then briefly touch on the different levels of quality of Chianti Classico. Wine has been produced in the area that's now known as Chianti Classico for centuries, but in this video I'm going to discuss only that history that's relevant to Chianti Classico. In the 1930s, the Italian government decided that it would be a good idea to greatly expand the production zone for Chianti. This was done so that producers could expand capacity and still use the name Chianti, which had substantial name recognition and prestige, and which would allow those producers to readily sell that wine. At that time, the name Chianti Classico was given to the historic or classic production zone, and the area that was newly created is what is now referred to as Chianti DOCG, and it included a number of subzones at that time as well. Importantly, however, the area that's now known as Chianti DOCG does not share the same soils or elevation as Chianti Classico. In 1996, Chianti Classico became its own autonomous DOCG. In other words, since that time, it has no longer been a subzone of Chianti. Where is Chianti Classico? Well, it's in the hilly area between Florence and Siena. It's also an extremely large area, even in its own right, with more than 17,300 acres, or around 7,000 hectares, planted to vine. Further, just Chianti Classico alone produces close to 4 million cases of wine annually. Sangiovese is the dominant grape used to make Chianti Classico. Sangiovese can be a difficult grape to grow. This is so because it has a very long growing season. It buds early and it ripens late. As such, it's prone to early spring frosts, but it's also vulnerable to early rains in the fall. Sangiovese performs best on south and southeast facing slopes because there it has ideal sun exposure, and Sangiovese thus has the best chance to ripen. Sangiovese performs especially well in the hills of Chianti Classico, where the elevations range from 200 to 550 meters above sea level. At these elevations, Sangiovese is able to achieve full ripeness over a much longer growing season, and this helps the fruit preserve acidity and freshness. Have you ever had a Sangiovese-based wine and thought, this is very, very thin and insipid and really very disappointing? But then the next time you'll order a Sangiovese-based wine, it could be intensely concentrated and just absolutely fabulous? Well, there's a reason for that. It's because Sangiovese is capable of producing extremely high yields. But unless the producer is a quality-minded producer that makes a conscious decision to restrict the yields and make sure there's a lower harvest of grapes, you're going to end up with an uninspiring and disappointing wine. So you definitely want to be sure to focus on a quality-minded producer. There are at least 4 reasons why Chianti Classico wines can offer such high quality. First, as mentioned, Sangiovese-based wines are at their best when yields are restricted, and Chianti Classico has much more stringent yield requirements than Chianti DOCG does. In addition, the elevations in Chianti Classico are much higher than for most of Chianti DOCG, and those higher elevations also help to produce higher quality Sangiovese. The soils in Chianti Classico are also ideally situated for the production of high quality Sangiovese. This is so because they combine good drainage with water holding capacity. There's at least 3 different soil types, including the famous Glestro soils. Glestro soils are a mix of schistous crumbly rock with clay and marl. Glestro soils are said to produce some of the most aromatic wines. The second type of soils in Chianti Classico is Albarese soils. These produce wines that are a little bit more structured with a more full body. and there's also some sandy or sandstone-based soils. Of course, these first three factors have been in existence for many years and help to contribute to a baseline level of quality for Chianti Classico. But I've noticed a dramatic increase in the quality of Chianti Classico the past 5 or 10 years or so, and I think it's only going to keep getting better. And what's to explain for that more recent increase in quality? Well, it's the Chianti Classico 2000 project. What was that? Well, that was a study that was done to try to identify some of the best clones to use to produce Sangiovese in Chianti Classico. The ultimate goal was to produce smaller berries with thicker skin in more open bunches so that you would have grapes that had deeper color, more flavor intensity, and better disease resistance. The study identified 7 different clones that could be used to accomplish those objectives, and so producers immediately got to work replanting some of their vineyards with these newly identified clones. And that has resulted in substantial improvement in the quality of the fruit that's being produced in Chianti Classico. Indeed, I visited Chianti Classico about a year and a half ago and met with some producers, and they confirmed both that they've been replanting their vineyards with some of these clones and that the fruit has been extremely high quality as a result. And so going forward, I expect Chianti Classico wine to only continue to improve as these newly replanted vineyards gain some additional age and the wines develop additional complexity. There's 3 different levels of quality for Chianti Classico wines. The first level is Chianti Classico Annata. The second level is Chianti Classico Riserve. And the highest tier in terms of quality is Chianti Classico Gran Selezione. At least for the time being, all 3 categories are subject to the same blending requirements. Namely, they have to have at least 80% Sangiovese in the blend, although many producers, as a practical matter, will at least use 90% Sangiovese. This compares favorably to Chianti DOCG, which only has a requirement to use 70% Sangiovese in the blend. With respect to the remainder of the blend, producers are free to choose from a very long list of grapes that includes both indigenous grapes as well as international grapes such as Merlot. Unlike in Chianti DOCG, however, in Chianti Classico, it is not permitted to use white grapes in the blend. The first level, the entry level, is Chianti Classico Annata. There's 2 main requirements for the Annata, namely a minimum ABV percentage of 12%, and the wine has to age for about a year before it's released. More specifically, the Annata cannot be released until October, the year following harvest. Chianti Classico Riserve is the middle tier of Chianti Classico in terms of quality. Chianti Classico Riserve has a higher minimum alcohol by volume percentage requirement than the Annata. So Chianti Classico Riserve has to be 12.5% alcohol by volume. There's also a longer maturation requirement for the Riserve. Specifically, for the Riserve, you have to age it 2 years from the January after harvest. So Chianti Classico Riserve is definitely a step up in terms of both quality and cost. If you're interested in wine recommendations, wine collecting strategies, and learning more about wine, please do subscribe to my channel. I've been collecting wine for more than 15 years and also have a level 4 diploma from the WSET. So I have both formal certification as well as substantial practical knowledge from the School of Hard Knocks. The third and the highest tier of Chianti Classico is called Gran Selezione. Gran Selezione is a designation that was introduced by the Consorzio back in 2014 in order to promote the highest tier of Chianti Classico. To be able to use the Gran Selezione designation on the label, a producer must satisfy 3 requirements. First, there's a minimum alcohol by volume percentage requirement of 13%. Second, the fruit for the wine must come from estate-owned fruit. And third, the wine must be matured for 30 months, including 3 months in the bottle. There's no requirement for the wine to be matured in oak. The Chianti Classico governing body seems resolved to double down on the Gran Selezione designation, and in fact, they've been active with coming out with new regulations that could apply to Gran Selezione effective with the 2022 vintage. Specifically, they divided up the production zone into 8 different geographic areas, and effective with the 2022 vintage, producers may be able to use those additional geographic designations on the label. For example, since Castello di Volpaia is in Rada, they could potentially use that Rada designation on their bottlings of Gran Selezione. But the Chianti Classico governing body did not stop there. They also identified 3 additional geographic units that could be used on labels of Gran Selezione, beginning with the 2027 vintage. Perhaps more importantly, however, there's also some restrictions on the blending for Gran Selezione that would take effect with the 2027 vintage. Specifically, as of that vintage, Gran Selezione would have to be at least 90% Sangiovese, rather than the 80% requirement that's applicable currently. In addition, the remaining portion of the blend would have to be limited to 1 of 8 indigenous grape varieties. So producers would no longer be able to choose from the huge long list that they can select from now, which includes international varieties.